The word justice carries, for us, the idea of balance, order, and protection against tyranny. But throughout history, that same word has been used to justify some of the greatest atrocities ever committed against human beings. In medieval times and during the era of inquisitorial persecution, justice was not synonymous with fairness or humanity. On the contrary, more often than not, law became indistinguishable from cruelty, and the pursuit of truth was not governed by reason but by pain. Justice was stained with blood, and every sentence turned into a spectacle of horror. Imagine a time when there was no presumption of innocence, when a mere accusation was enough to destroy lives. A jealous neighbor, a whispered rumor, or a malicious denunciation could drag someone before authorities who judged not by evidence, but by suspicion. In this world, justice was less about protection and more about intimidation. The goal was not to uncover truth but to instill fear. And to achieve that, the cruelest methods were legitimized as part of the legal process. For centuries, torture and justice were treated as synonyms. There was a widespread belief that pain could reveal hidden truths, as if the human body were a lock that only opened under extreme suffering. Judges and inquisitors argued that agony broke lies and exposed honesty. But in reality, the opposite was true. People confessed to anything, even the most absurd of accusations, simply to end the torment. Still, these forced confessions were written down as undeniable proof. It was not only a matter of punishment after conviction. Torture was part of the very process of investigation. It was embedded into the system. The accused were shackled, stripped of dignity, and subjected to sessions that lasted hours, sometimes repeated across days, until their words matched what their interrogators wanted to hear. Pain replaced reason, and screams replaced arguments. The most disturbing part is how legitimate all of this seemed at the time. Society accepted these methods because people believed justice could not be wrong. If someone was under torture, it must mean they were guilty in some way. Merely being brought before a tribunal was already considered evidence enough. The accused was condemned long before their voice was heard. In this way, the law became an instrument of terror. Political and religious authorities used the rhetoric of justice to consolidate their power, eliminating adversaries, heretics, and dissenters. Physical pain became an official language. Instead of courts of reason, chambers of torment were erected, where the cries of the condemned were translated as confessions. And let us not think this was the product of simple ignorance. There was method, calculation, intention. Instruments of torture were developed with near scientific precision to inflict maximum suffering without causing immediate death. The goal was to prolong the agony, to break body and mind into submission. It was the logic of a justice system that did not merely want to punish, but to demonstrate power. Every victim became a warning. To defy the law was to defy survival itself. The public, too, became part of the machinery. Executions and punishments were staged as spectacles, with crowds gathering to witness the outcome of what was called justice. The suffering of others was transformed into theater, a grim lesson that instilled collective terror and ensured obedience. In this way, justice, instead of protecting society, held it captive in fear. This is why we speak of justice stained with blood. It was not about correcting wrongs or defending the innocent, but about sustaining a mechanism of power built on cruelty. Every sentence carried not only the pain of the condemned, but also the complicity of a society that accepted brutality as order. The line between law and barbarity disappeared, leaving behind a system in which torture was legitimized as a path to truth. That is the dark legacy of centuries of institutionalized cruelty, the reminder that when law divorces itself from humanity, justice ceases to be justice. It becomes tyranny. Justice, when corrupted by cruelty, is not abstract. It takes form in iron, wood, and rope, tools designed not for truth, but for suffering. Across centuries, societies invented and refined instruments of torture with an almost obsessive precision. These were not crude improvisations. They were carefully crafted machines of suffering, engineered to punish, humiliate, and terrify. Their existence was justified under the name of justice, but their purpose was far more sinister: to break the human spirit and turn pain into a performance of power. Perhaps the most infamous of these instruments was the rack. At first glance, it seemed deceptively simple. a wooden frame with rollers at either end, connected by ropes. The accused would be tied hand and foot, stretched across the device like a fragile thread. Then, with each crank of the rollers, the ropes tightened, pulling arms and legs in opposite directions. The joints cracked, muscles tore, bones splintered. It was not designed to kill swiftly, but to dislocate and mutilate, prolonging the agony until the victim would confess to anything demanded. The rack was a theater of destruction, and its creaking wood became one of the most feared sounds of medieval Europe. If the rack destroyed the body through dislocation, the Iron Maiden assaulted it with enclosure. This upright coffin, lined inside with spikes, was a grotesque fusion of prison and executioner. Victims were placed within, the doors closed, and the spikes pierced flesh in dozens of places. It's not deep enough to kill instantly, but sufficient to cause excruciating wounds that bled slowly. The Iron Maiden was not only a tool of torture, but of spectacle. The towering iron structure, with its grotesque appearance, symbolized the triumph of terror over mercy. To look upon it was to be reminded that justice in those days was not about fairness, but about fear. Then there was the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel. Victims were tied to a massive wooden wheel, their limbs splayed against the spokes. Executioners then used iron bars to smash arms and legs, shattering bones one by one. Sometimes the condemned would be left exposed on the wheel, their mangled bodies displayed as a warning to all. The breaking wheel was both a sentence and a message. Disobedience to the law would end in public dismemberment. It was slow, brutal, and humiliating, a reminder that justice was not blind, but merciless. Other instruments took on forms that revealed an almost theatrical creativity and cruelty. The pear of anguish, for instance, was a small metallic device inserted into the mouth or other orifices. With the turn of a screw, its metal petals expanded outward, tearing tissue from within. It was silent, surgical in its torment, and deeply humiliating. Victims were not simply made to suffer. They were degraded in ways designed to strip away dignity. This was not only punishment, but psychological domination, ensuring that pain was accompanied by shame. Equally horrifying was the strapado, a method of suspension rather than a machine in itself, but one often accompanied by pulley systems engineered for maximum torment. Victims had their arms tied behind their backs and were hoisted into the air by ropes, sometimes with weights added to their ankles. The strain dislocated shoulders and tore muscles apart. The silence of the method, the creaking of rope, the groans of wood, made it all the more terrifying. No blade, no blood, just the crushing agony of one's own body tearing itself apart. These instruments were not isolated inventions. They formed part of a vast repertoire of cruelty that spread across cultures and centuries. Inquisitorial dungeons, royal courts, and city squares all housed these devices, each one presented as a legitimate tool of law. Blacksmiths crafted them. Executioners mastered them. Judges authorized them. Societies watched them in silence, often gathered in crowds to witness their use. It is crucial to understand that these machines of suffering were not merely functional, they were symbolic. The rack stretched not just the body, but the boundaries of fear. The Iron Maiden enclosed not just flesh, but the imagination of an entire people. The breaking wheel crushed not only bones, but the idea of rebellion. These devices were designed to communicate as much as to punish, they said. The law is absolute, the body is fragile, and pain is the language of truth. The humiliation they inflicted was as deliberate as the pain. Torture was often public, a form of theater where the condemned became both actor and victim. Crowds watched as screams filled the air, as joints cracked and blood spilled. The instruments were positioned in squares or brought into courts to ensure visibility. Justice became a spectacle, and suffering became entertainment cloaked in legality. The condemned lost not only their bodies, but their dignity, reduced to objects of fear, stripped of humanity before the eyes of their peers. Some devices, like the Spanish chair or the chair of torture, combined both endurance and humiliation. Covered with sharp spikes, victims were forced to sit strapped for hours or days, sometimes with heat applied beneath the chair to intensify the torment. The act of sitting, the most basic gesture of rest, was transformed into agony. The victim's own weight became an instrument of pain, as every shift, every movement drove spikes deeper into the flesh. It was not quick. It was not merciful. It was endless suffering disguised as interrogation. And then there were the devices that blurred the line between punishment and mockery. Masks of shame, grotesque iron contraptions, shaped into the faces of animals or demons, were locked onto the heads of the accused. They did not mutilate, but they humiliated. The condemned were paraded through streets, jeered at, ridiculed, their faces forced into symbols of degradation. Justice here was not about truth, but about stripping away honor, turning punishment into humiliation that outlasted the pain. The terrifying reality is that these machines were not hidden away as dark curiosities. They were celebrated, displayed, and in some cases even improved upon from generation to generation. Manuals described their use. Illustrations depicted their operation. Authorities claimed they were necessary, that society could not survive without them. And the people, many of them fearful of becoming victims themselves, accepted this machinery of cruelty as part of their world. Yet behind every crank of the rack, every turn of the screw, every shattered bone, there was a person, an individual whose suffering was justified in the name of order. Each device stands as a monument not only to cruelty but to the corruption of justice itself. For what greater betrayal of justice can there be than transforming it into an instrument of pain? Looking back, these machines of suffering reveal something deeply unsettling about human history. They show how law can be twisted into tyranny, how authority can weaponize fear, and how creativity can be directed not toward beauty or progress, but toward inflicting agony. The rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden, these are not just artifacts of torture. They are reminders that justice, when corrupted, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they remind us that these instruments were not relics of a barbaric fringe. They were mainstream. They were normalized. They were called justice. And in that normalization lies the true horror. The fact that entire societies accepted machines of suffering as legitimate expressions of law. The Inquisition stands as one of the most chilling examples of how faith and law can intertwine to create a system of terror. Its stated mission was noble on the surface, to defend the purity of belief, to protect souls from heresy, and to preserve unity within the faith. But beneath that pious mask lay a machinery of cruelty that transformed devotion into domination. Torture was not an aberration of the Inquisition. It was central to its function. Pain became the chosen instrument to root out truth, and salvation was pursued through methods that inflicted hell on earth. The Inquisition was not born in secrecy. It was established openly, sanctioned by both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Its goal was to identify, prosecute, and punish those who strayed from accepted doctrine. Heresy, in this context, was not merely disbelief. It was defined so broadly that nearly anyone could fall under suspicion. Those who questioned doctrine, practiced alternative rituals, or even failed to display sufficient devotion. Under such a system, faith ceased to be voluntary. It was coerced and forced through fear. Torture in the Inquisition was not portrayed as cruelty, but as necessity. Inquisitors argued that heresy was worse than any crime against the body, for it endangered not only the individual's soul, but the eternal fate of entire communities. If eternal damnation awaited the heretic, then inflicting temporary suffering was framed as an act of mercy, a corrective measure to save the soul. This theological justification turned brutality into duty, and in doing so, stripped cruelty of guilt. One of the most commonly used devices by the Inquisition was the strapado. Victims had their arms tied behind their backs, a rope attached to their wrists, and were then hoisted into the air by pulleys. Sometimes weights were tied to their feet. Shoulders dislocated under the strain, muscles tore, and joints snapped. Yet the victim remained alive, writhing in agony. Inquisitors claimed that such pain loosened tongues, breaking lies and exposing truth. In reality, it broke bodies and minds, forcing confessions that were more about survival than honesty. Another favored technique was the rack. The victim stretched across its wooden frame, endured the slow, systematic dislocation of joints as ropes tightened with every turn of the crank. What is especially haunting about the Inquisition's use of the rack was the meticulousness with which it was applied. Records describe inquisitors taking careful notes of the victims' responses, treating screams as data and agony as evidence. The courtroom became a laboratory of pain, with the accused as both subject and proof. Water torture, too, found a place in the inquisitorial repertoire. Victims were forced to ingest large amounts of water, poured through funnels or cloths pressed over their mouths. The body's reflexive panic at drowning created terror beyond imagination, the sensation of suffocation, the bloated stomach, the violent spasms. These were all calculated tools to induce confession. Inquisitors claimed this was not torture at all, merely inducing discomfort, a chilling euphemism that reveals how language was twisted to disguise cruelty. But beyond the methods themselves, what made the Inquisition's torture uniquely terrifying was its moral framing. Unlike bandits or tyrants, the Inquisitors believed, or at least claimed to believe, that they were instruments of God's will. They prayed before and after sessions of torment. They wore the robes of clergy, spoke in the language of salvation, and justified every scream as a step toward redemption. To the victim, there was no refuge, for the torturer presented himself not as an enemy, but as a savior. It was a perverse inversion of faith, where the hands that inflicted pain were said to be delivering mercy. The psychological torment extended beyond the chamber. Accusations of heresy often began with rumors. Neighbors denounced neighbors, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of malice, knowing that the Inquisition's shadow loomed over every household. Once accused, escape was nearly impossible. The mere act of being summoned was seen as guilt. The accused entered a world where silence was complicity, words were traps, and pain was inevitable. Trials were stacked against them, with inquisitors serving as prosecutor, judge, and spiritual authority all at once. Confession was the goal, and torture was the path. Once a confession was extracted, often under excruciating torment, it became irreversible. Even if the victim retracted their words afterward, the confession stood. The logic was circular. The pain had revealed the truth, and any denial was just further proof of heresy. In this way, torture was not a tool to discover truth, but a mechanism to fabricate it, turning the cries of agony into legal certainty. The outcomes were varied but uniformly grim. Some victims, broken by torture, admitted to false heresies, implicating themselves and others in desperate attempts to end their torment. Others, unable to endure, perished under interrogation. Those who survived often faced execution or lifelong imprisonment, their bodies shattered, their spirits destroyed. And all of it was done in the name of protecting the faith. What is perhaps most horrifying is how public the Inquisition's justice became. Sentences were read aloud in solemn ceremonies. Punishments, whether imprisonment, exile, or execution, were staged as moral lessons for the community. The torture chamber was secret, but its results were displayed openly. The spectacle of punishment was meant to reinforce obedience, ensuring that no one would dare stray from doctrine. In this way, the Inquisition turned fear into policy, embedding terror into the very fabric of society. Even centuries later, the shadow of inquisitorial torture lingers. Its methods, its language, and its justifications echo in modern systems that still weaponize fear under the guise of protection. The Inquisition's legacy is not confined to history books. It remains a warning that when institutions claim absolute moral authority, cruelty can be reframed as virtue, and torture can masquerade as salvation. The terror of the Inquisition lies not only in its devices of pain, but in its perverse logic. To be tortured by an enemy is horror. To be tortured by those who claim to save you is despair beyond words. Victims did not merely endure physical torment. They endured the collapse of trust in the very faith they had lived by. The cross, once a symbol of hope, became a shadow over the rack. The prayer, once a comfort, became a prelude to agony. The sacred itself was weaponized, and that is why the Inquisition still haunts our collective memory. It was not just an institution of persecution, it was a mirror held up to humanity, revealing how belief can be corrupted into brutality, how law can be twisted into tyranny, and how sacred language can mask the most profane acts. The tortures justified by the sacred remind us that cruelty, when wrapped in piety, is all the more dangerous, for it convinces not only the oppressor, but sometimes even the oppressed, that their suffering is righteous. In every age of cruelty, there is a disturbing truth. Suffering has always had an audience. The torture chambers of the Inquisition may have been hidden behind stone walls, but punishment did not end there. Once confessions were extracted, once sentences were passed, the condemned were often brought into the open, dragged into town squares, marketplaces, and fields, where their agony became a public performance. Justice was not only enacted but displayed, transformed into a grotesque form of entertainment. The executioner was not simply an agent of law, but the conductor of a spectacle, and the crowd became both witness and accomplice. Public punishments had a dual purpose. On one hand, they were designed to terrify, to remind every person present of the consequences of defiance. On the other, they fed a darker instinct, the fascination with watching others suffer. Communities gathered not only out of fear, but out of curiosity. The line between deterrent and entertainment blurred until it vanished entirely. To live in those times was to live in a world where cruelty was ritual and pain was theater. One of the most infamous forms of public punishment was execution by burning. The condemned were bound to stakes, surrounded by piles of wood, and set aflame before the eyes of hundreds, sometimes thousands. Officials claimed this was a purification, a cleansing of sin through fire, but to the crowd it was a spectacle. The screams, the flames, the rising smoke, all became part of a ritual performance. Vendors sold food at the edges of the gathering, children sat on their parents' shoulders to get a better view, and the condemned were reduced to actors in a fiery drama staged under the banner of justice. Equally notorious was the practice of hanging. Sometimes reserved for common criminals, other times used to send a political message. Gallows were often built in central locations, towering over markets or roads, ensuring maximum visibility. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, jeered at, pelted with filth, and then forced up the scaffold. The drop of the body, the snapping of the neck, the twitching of limbs, all of it unfolded under the gaze of a crowd that cheered, gasped, or remained silent in grim fascination. In many cases, the bodies were left hanging for days, a rotting reminder that the law never slept. For crimes deemed especially heinous, execution methods became even more elaborate. The breaking wheel, for example, was both a torture device and a spectacle of death. Victims were strapped to the massive wooden wheel, their limbs smashed with iron clubs until bones shattered and bodies twisted grotesquely around the spokes. Sometimes they were left alive, their mangled forms displayed as a warning, their moans echoing into the night. The crowd gathered not only to witness justice, but to indulge in the macabre fascination of prolonged suffering. Other punishments were theatrical in different ways. Public flogging reduced victims to trembling figures before the eyes of their neighbors, stripped to the waist, tied to posts. Their backs were whipped until flesh tore and blood spattered onto the ground. Each strike was both punishment and performance, each cry from the victim a reminder of law's cruelty. The crowd reacted with a mix of horror, satisfaction, and indifference. What mattered was that pain was made visible, that justice was staged for all to see. Humiliation often played as great a role as physical suffering. Stocks and pillories were erected in public squares, where offenders were locked by the head and hands for hours or even days. Unable to move, they were subjected to ridicule, pelted with food scraps, stones, or worse. The punishment was not simply the confinement itself, but the degradation inflicted by the community. The condemned became objects of mockery, their humanity stripped away in favor of spectacle. Justice, in this sense, was less about correcting behavior and more about enforcing conformity through public shaming. Even mutilations were staged for maximum effect. Hands were chopped off, tongues cut out, ears sliced away, all performed in the open, with the executioner often holding the severed body part aloft for the crowd to see. The symbolism was clear: speak against authority and lose your tongue. Steal and lose your hand. These were punishments not just for the condemned, but for everyone watching, lessons carved into flesh and burned into memory. What is most disturbing is how normalized these events became. They were scheduled, anticipated, and discussed like festivals. Announcements spread through towns, drawing people from miles away. Crowds gathered early to secure good vantage points. There was a sense of ceremony, processions, prayers, proclamations, all framing cruelty as legitimate, necessary, and even sacred. The theater of suffering was integrated into the rhythm of life, reinforcing obedience through fear and fascination alike. The executioner himself became a strange kind of performer. Feared, despised, yet necessary, he carried out the rituals of death with grim precision. His role was not only to inflict pain, but to do so in a way that satisfied the crowd's expectation of justice. Too swift, and people muttered about wasted spectacle. Too clumsy, and he risked becoming the object of scorn. The executioner walked a fine line, balancing efficiency with theater, embodying the brutality of the law while also serving the darker appetites of the audience. Behind all of this was a simple truth. Public punishments reinforced authority. The spectacle was a form of psychological warfare, embedding obedience into the collective mind. Watching another human suffer in such a visible, ritualized manner left deep impressions. It said, "This could be you." It said, "Defy the order, and you will not just be punished. You will be humiliated, broken, destroyed, and everyone you know will watch it happen." The theater of cruelty was as much about collective control as individual penalty. And yet, these events reveal something unsettling about human nature itself. Crowds did not attend purely out of fear, but they attended out of fascination. The same impulses that draw us to stories of horror today once drew people to the gallows and the stake. There is a morbid curiosity in suffering, a dark allure in witnessing the breaking of bodies and the extinguishing of life. The authorities exploited this instinct, turning it into a tool of governance, blending justice and entertainment until they became indistinguishable. As centuries passed, the brutality of public punishments began to be questioned. Philosophers and reformers argued that justice should be about correction, not cruelty, that pain should not be paraded as theater. Slowly, the spectacles declined, replaced by prisons, fines, and other forms of control. But the memory remains, haunting history, with the reminder that entire societies once gathered in celebration of agony. The legacy of these spectacles is not easily erased. They remind us that cruelty thrives not only in dark chambers, but also in open squares. That suffering can be legitimized when framed as law, and that entire communities can be bound together by the shared experience of watching others destroyed. The stage of justice in those days was not a courtroom, but a scaffold, a stake, a wheel. And the performance, repeated endlessly, was one of pain. In modern times, the idea of evidence is inseparable from facts. Documents, witnesses, material proof that can withstand scrutiny. But in the darker corners of history, evidence was not drawn from reason or observation. It was drawn from the human body itself, twisted and broken until it yielded the words that inquisitors, judges, or rulers wanted to hear. Pain became testimony, agony became proof, and the courtroom was not a place of impartial judgment, but an extension of the torture chamber. The belief that suffering revealed truth was deeply rooted in societies that prized order over justice. Pain, they thought, stripped away lies. Under the strain of dislocated joints or the suffocating flood of water down the throat, a person could no longer maintain deception. The tortured body became a vessel of revelation, its screams and forced confessions presented as the purest form of evidence. But this belief ignored the obvious, that the human instinct to survive overrides everything. People will confess to anything, admit to any crime, implicate anyone if it means the torment might end. Truth was not discovered in those chambers. It was manufactured. Consider the strapetto, a method infamous among inquisitorial courts. Victims were suspended by ropes tied behind their backs, often with weights attached to their feet. The body stretched in unnatural ways, shoulders wrenched from their sockets, muscles tearing, bones snapping. Each moment of agony drew cries that interrogators interpreted as truth. Confess, they demanded, and eventually the victim would, not because they were guilty, but because pain left them no choice. And once the words were spoken, they became permanent. The confession extracted under torment was written down as evidence, even if the victim retracted it later. The rack followed a similar logic. To every turn of the wheel, the ropes tightened, pulling limbs apart with unbearable precision. Inquisitors sat nearby, calmly recording answers between screams. The spectacle of dislocated joints and tearing tendons was not just cruelty, It was framed as procedure, as the mechanical extraction of facts. To resist was impossible. To endure was futile. Eventually, the body surrendered, and the words of the accused, false or not, were enshrined as irrefutable proof. Water torture, too, became a perverse form of evidence gathering. Victims gagged and choked as liquid flooded their lungs, their bodies convulsing in the primal terror of drowning. In that panic, they spoke whatever was demanded, desperate for air. Inquisitors claimed that such confessions were reliable because they came at the brink of death. But what they truly revealed was the power of desperation, the lengths to which a human will go to survive. The body was not yielding truth, it was yielding surrender. The brutality was not confined to the devices themselves. Interrogations were carefully staged, designed to wear down not just the body, but the mind. The accused might be shown the instruments first, the iron chair studded with spikes, a pair of anguish with its cruel expanding petals, the glowing coals prepared for branding. The sight alone was enough to break many into immediate confession. For those who resisted, the instruments were applied with calculated rhythm, escalating pain until the body betrayed the mind. Humiliation often played as much a role as agony. Confessions were not only about words, they were about submission. Victims were stripped, chained, paraded before judges as their dignity was dismantled alongside their strength. The physical torment forced the body to yield, but the psychological torment ensured that the confession was not just admission, but degradation. It was designed to destroy the will, leaving the accused broken in every sense before the law. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was how confessions were treated afterward. Once recorded, they carried the weight of absolute truth. The courtroom did not ask whether the words were spoken freely or under duress. The cries of the tortured, transcribed by clerks, became binding evidence. In some cases, victims who survived the chamber retracted their words, insisting they were forced, but the system rejected such claims. To deny the confession was considered further proof of guilt. Pain, once inflicted, could not be undone. This twisted reliance on confessions created endless cycles of accusation. One victim, desperate to lessen their own torment, might name others, dragging neighbors, friends, or rivals into the same machinery of cruelty. Each new confession generated new suspects, and the system fed on itself like a beast that could never be satisfied. Entire communities fell under suspicion, their members ensnared by chains of false admissions forged in agony. The body as evidence did not simply convict individuals, it corrupted entire societies. Even when executions followed, the confession remained central. A heretic burned at the stake was not just punished, they were displayed as someone who had confessed. Their final words, extracted under torment, were used to justify the fire. The crowd watching saw not an innocent condemned, but a criminal exposed, their guilt confirmed by their own mouth. In this way, torture served not only to break the victim, but to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. The system relied on the body's betrayal to convince the masses that justice had been served. What makes this history so haunting is the way it blurred the line between truth and performance. Confessions became scripts, written by pain and delivered by the broken. Inquisitors claimed to reveal hidden heresies, but in reality, they authored them through torment. The accused became unwilling actors in a play of power, their suffering the dialogue, their words the climax, their execution the finale. The audience, society itself, accepted the performance as truth. Looking back, it is easy to see the futility of such practices. Pain does not reveal truth, it reveals desperation. The body, when crushed by torment, becomes a liar, saying anything to escape. But at the time, this was ignored. The system of justice demanded confessions, and torture supplied them. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was obedience, conformity, and the demonstration of power. The legacy of these practices is not confined to the past. They remind us how fragile truth becomes when institutions of power value control over justice. The body as evidence is the darkest perversion of law, a system where survival is mistaken for guilt and screams are mistaken for facts. It is a warning from history that evidence extracted through pain is not evidence at all. It is theater, coercion, and cruelty masquerading as justice. For the victims, the ordeal did not end in the chamber. Their bodies carried the marks of torment, their dignity stripped, their names forever stained by confessions they never meant. Some died under torture, never even reaching trial. Others were executed with their false words still echoing. Their humanity was erased by a system that treated their broken bodies as parchment and their screams as ink. And so, when we speak of the body as evidence, we are speaking of one of history's greatest betrayals, the transformation of justice into tyranny, of truth into lies, of humanity into tools of control. Pain was never proof. Agony was never evidence. Yet for centuries, entire systems of law insisted otherwise, leaving behind a legacy drenched in suffering and deceit. When we look back at the instruments of torture, the public executions, and the confessions extracted under agony, it is tempting to believe that such horrors are confined to the past, relics of a darker, more primitive age. We want to imagine that we have evolved, that justice has purified itself, that cruelty no longer hides behind the robes of authority. But the truth is far more unsettling. The legacy of those practices lingers like a shadow, shaping institutions, haunting societies, and reminding us that justice has always been vulnerable to corruption. The stains left by torture and spectacle are not easily washed away. The first and most enduring legacy is the corruption of truth. For centuries, the idea that pain could reveal honesty infected entire systems of law. It established the dangerous precedent that evidence could be manufactured, that words forced under duress could be taken as fact. This legacy lingers in modern debates about coercion, false confessions, and the reliability of testimony. History shows us what happens when truth is confused with survival, when institutions prefer obedience to accuracy. The confessions written in agony centuries ago still echo in wrongful convictions today. The second legacy is psychological. The spectacle of public punishment may have vanished from our town squares, but its imprint remains. Societies once united by the collective viewing of suffering carried those scars forward. Violence is entertainment, cruelty is spectacle. These instincts did not disappear. They evolved, finding new forms in stories, literature, even in modern media that thrives on narratives of horror and crime. The fascination with watching others suffer, once indulged in the marketplace at the gallows, now finds subtler outlets, but the appetite is the same. History's theater of pain never truly closed. It simply changed its stage. The third legacy lies in the institutions themselves. The Inquisition, for example, demonstrated how faith and law, when fused, can justify almost any cruelty. That precedent did not vanish with its dissolution. Across centuries, rulers, regimes, and even modern states have invoked higher causes: security, order, morality, to excuse practices that strip individuals of humanity. The instruments may be different, but the logic is familiar. Suffering reframed as necessity, cruelty disguised as protection. It is the same reasoning that allowed inquisitors to pray before turning the rack, echoed today in systems where power insists that brutality is the price of safety. Then, there's the legacy of fear. Torture, when normalized, does not end with the victim. It seeps into the consciousness of entire communities, teaching silence, obedience, and complicity. Centuries of public punishments conditioned people to see cruelty not as anomaly, but as law. That memory lingers in collective psychology, passed down as cautionary tales, myths, and cultural attitudes toward authority. Even where the gallows have rotted and the racks have rusted, the memory of what law once permitted keeps fear alive. Justice, for many, is not a promise of fairness, but a reminder of danger. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is the normalization of cruelty. The true horror of medieval and inquisitorial torture is not only what was done, but how accepted it became. Instruments of torment were crafted by artisans, sanctioned by judges, and witnessed by crowds without question. That normalization reveals how fragile morality can be when authority declares brutality necessary. The lesson for us today is stark. Cruelty, once justified, spreads quickly. What is shocking at first becomes ordinary with repetition, until entire societies participate in horror under the illusion of justice. This legacy haunts us because it is not confined to medieval dungeons or inquisitorial chambers. It reappears whenever power prioritizes control over humanity, whenever institutions silence dissent by force, Whenever pain is used to extract compliance, the methods may change. The Iron Maiden, replaced by solitary confinement. The breaking wheel replaced by psychological torment. But the principle is the same. Justice can still be twisted into tyranny, and cruelty can still be dressed in the robes of law. We also inherit the stories of resistance. Though many were broken, some victims left behind testimonies, letters, or whispered accounts of what they endured. These fragments remind us that beneath the machinery of cruelty, humanity persisted. Even in the darkest chambers, people clung to dignity, resisted as long as they could, or exposed the corruption of their accusers. Their courage becomes part of the legacy, too, a reminder that cruelty may dominate for a time, but never completely erases the human will to resist. The legacy of torture also forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Justice is never fixed. It is not a permanent achievement, but a fragile balance that must be defended constantly. The same societies that once celebrated public executions believed they were just. The same inquisitors who dislocated shoulders on the rack claimed they were saving souls. History shows us how easily law can be corrupted by ideology, fear, or ambition. It warns us that justice, without vigilance, can become indistinguishable from cruelty. Even the ruins of castles, dungeons, and gallows remind us of this legacy. Tourists today may wander through museums where racks and Iron Maidens stand behind glass, relics of a bygone era. But these are not just curiosities. They are monuments to human cruelty, silent warnings carved in iron and wood. They whisper to us across centuries. This happened, it was accepted, and it can happen again. Their presence is both history and prophecy, urging us not to forget. The final legacy is moral. Torture in the name of justice forces us to ask what justice truly means. Is it the enforcement of order at any cost? Is it the obedience of the many secured through the suffering of the few? Or is it something higher? Fairness, dignity, humanity? The centuries of blood-stained justice remind us of the danger of answering those questions carelessly. For when justice is stripped of compassion, it ceases to be justice at all. It becomes tyranny cloaked in law. And so, the story of torture as justice is not just history. It is a mirror. When we look into it, we see not only the past, but ourselves, our institutions, our instincts, our vulnerabilities. The legacy of the rack, the wheel, the stake, and the strappado is not confined to distant centuries. It warns us that cruelty thrives when unchecked, that fear can disguise itself as truth, and that entire societies can accept horror when it is called justice. The dark legacy of these practices is that they still haunt us, not only in memory, but in the very structure of how we think about power and law. They remind us that every generation must choose whether justice will be defined by cruelty or by compassion. And if we fail to choose, if we allow fear to dictate our systems, then the instruments may change, but the suffering will not. The rack will have new forms, the wheel new spokes, the fire new fuel. History has already shown us the cost of forgetting. The true test of our time is whether we will remember. When we began this journey, we stepped into a world where the word justice did not mean fairness, balance, or truth. It meant power. It meant fear. It meant the body twisted until it surrendered to the demands of authority. Across centuries, the courts of kings, inquisitors, and judges blurred the line between law and cruelty, leaving behind a legacy written not in parchment but in blood. To conclude, we must look back at these 6 shadows of history and understand not only what they did, but what they left behind. It began with the corruption of justice itself. The mere accusation was enough to destroy a life, and pain became the courtroom's central argument. Instead of reason, there were screams. Instead of evidence, there were broken bones. Justice was stained with blood long before the instruments appeared, because the very idea of guilt was decided not by proof, but by fear. The system was not designed to protect the innocent. It was designed to control the masses. From this corruption sprang the machines of suffering. Racks, wheels, Iron Maidens, spiked chairs, masks of shame. These were not crude improvisations. They were carefully crafted instruments, designed with a precision that still horrifies us today. Each turn of the crank, each swing of the club, Each iron spike was calculated not to kill, but to prolong, to stretch the moment of agony until the victim would confess to anything, admit to everything, and submit entirely. Pain was transformed into a technology, a weaponized science of suffering. But cruelty never walks alone. It needs justification, and in the case of the Inquisition, that justification came cloaked in the sacred. The torturer wore the robes of a priest, spoke in the language of salvation, and claimed that agony was mercy. To inflict torment was to save a soul. To crush the body was to purify the spirit. It was this perverse logic that made the Inquisition so terrifying, because it turned the sacred into a weapon and left the victim with nowhere to hide. Not even God seemed safe, because his name was invoked in every scream. And cruelty did not remain hidden behind dungeon walls. It became spectacle. Gallows rose in marketplaces, stakes burned in the squares, and wheels turned in the open fields. Entire communities gathered to watch suffering as if it were theater. The condemned became actors, their pain the script, their death the climax. The executioner was the master of ceremonies, and the crowd the chorus that validated the performance. Fear was taught not in classrooms, but in fire, rope, and iron, displayed where all could see. At the heart of it all was the body as evidence. Pain was mistaken for truth, agony for honesty. A broken body, trembling on the rack or gasping for air during water torture, became the parchment on which confessions were written. And those confessions, no matter how absurd, were treated as unshakable proof. One victim's words dragged another into the chamber, and the cycle fed on itself endlessly. Justice was not about discovery. It was about fabrication, a theater of lies scripted by torment. The legacy of all this cruelty is perhaps the most haunting chapter of all, because torture in the name of justice did not vanish. It left scars that still shape the world today. It taught societies to accept fear as law. It normalized cruelty as procedure, showed rulers that pain could be as effective as truth in maintaining power. And even as the rack rusts in museums and the gallows crumble to dust, the memory remains, reminding us how fragile justice can be when humanity is stripped away. So what does this history tell us? It's that justice is not guaranteed. It is fragile, vulnerable to corruption by fear, power, and ideology. The same forces that once built racks and wheels can take new forms today. The instruments may change, but the principle, the use of suffering to enforce obedience, remains a threat. The worst tortures in the name of justice remind us that cruelty is not only possible, but often justified by the very institutions meant to protect us. And this is why these stories matter. They are not relics. They are warnings. They tell us what happens when fear replaces fairness, when pain replaces truth, when law becomes theater. They show us how entire societies, convinced of their righteousness, can participate in horrors so great they echo for centuries. They remind us that justice without compassion is not justice at all, but tyranny disguised in robes and ritual. The rack, the iron maiden, the wheel, the stake. These were not just instruments of death, they were mirrors. They reflect what happens when we allow cruelty to masquerade as order. No. They reflect the darkest corners of human nature. The hunger for control, the fascination with suffering, the silence of those who stood by. And when we look into those mirrors, we must ask ourselves, what do we see today? The conclusion is this: the worst tortures ever used in the name of justice are not merely history's horrors. They are humanity's warning. They whisper to us across time, urging us never to forget that justice is only as strong as our commitment to protect the vulnerable, to value truth over fear, to choose compassion over cruelty. For if we forget, if we allow fear to dictate law once again, the rack will return in new forms. The wheel will turn again, and justice will once more be written not in truth, but in blood. And so, the story ends as it began, with a reminder. Justice is a fragile flame. It can light the path to fairness, or it can be smothered and twisted into darkness. The worst tortures in the name of justice show us how easily that flame can be extinguished. The question left to us is whether we will guard it, or whether we will allow the shadows of history to rise once more.
History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.